Nowadays, negates are so incredibly popular that literally everyone and their mother can make some, but it wasn't always the case. What's going on, guys? This is Mias, and today we will try to figure out whether negates and interruptions, whatever you want to call them, are actually needed for Yu-Gi-Oh! Whether you go first or second. But before you start, friendly reminder to like and subscribe. Yeah, let's jump right into it. Okay, so just before I actually jump into the subject, I just want to give you guys a little history lesson, just so we have a clear understanding of what we are even trying to talk about. So back in the days, in like 2005, 2006, 2004 even, and 2003 with like Yada Law, Chaos Control, Goat format, and all those really old decks, people barely did anything on turn 1. They would like set a monster with set anywhere between 0, 1, or 2 back row, and that's pretty much it. They would just call it a day there, because they weren't really turn 1 combos that people even did back then. You were just trying to go for the long run, get as many resources as possible, and make your opponent waste his powerful cards on some plays that you don't really care about. You would usually win the grind game from there. Even after a few years after the GOAT format, people weren't even making enormous boards as we are seeing now. Like Black Wings, for example, they weren't doing much. Like activate Black Whirlwind, normal summon Shura, search a card, maybe set Icarus attack or whatever other trap, and that was kind of sometimes enough. Like the turn 1 wasn't making actual negations or interruptions the majority of the time, but decks were still very powerful, and people would still kind of rely sometimes on the dice roll, because even if you weren't making interruptions on your turn 1, you were generating advantage before your opponent had the opportunity to gather his advantage. The game, however, evolved extremely quickly, with Frog FTK winning Worlds in 2010. Shoutouts to Galileo, by the way, if you're watching this video. Potentially, that gave everyone the sign that certain decks could finally start seeing just gigantic combos being done on their very first turn. Imagine killing someone before your opponent even has a chance of playing in the first place. Frog FTK could do that with like Substitute and Mass Driver, 2 cards that are still banned today, if I recall correctly. But yeah, I mean, obviously you kind of understand why. Even though the deck wasn't making a really like an actual infinite loop, you could be burning your opponent for 8k damage just by tributing 20 monsters on your very first turn, because Substitute wasn't a once per turn clause. So if you were going first, you could kill your opponent without even having to go through the loops of making negates and letting your opponent play just to actually think about what to negate. The game was actually a bit more simple than that, and even with Exodia being actually playable competitively speaking, ironically, the deck wasn't really trying to make actual negates, but it was winning the game by stalling the game as much as possible, and obviously eventually drawing the 5 pieces of Exodia. So even the actual form of negations that people used were completely different, because now we're pretty much using monster bodies that are negations, like Herald of Ultimateness, Borload Savage Dragon, Cyber Dragon Infinity, Dragoon, whereas before the actual negations were maybe Floodgates or Solemn Judgment or generic staples that pretty much everyone could use, or maybe even hand traps. Max C, to a certain extent, was a card that, since everybody could play it, it wasn't considered to be, you know, as sacky as it would be in today's metagame, but that was actually a card that kind of did prevent your opponent from exploding too much on the very first turn. After that, we saw Dragon Rulers. Despite being extremely good, they weren't, again, making pretty much anything on their very first turn, even though they kind of could draw several cards with Super Rejuvenation, but their very first turn, if anything, they were maybe setting 1 or 2 back row. I can't really think of like gigantic mass Omni negates that Dragon Rulers were doing, especially not on turn 1. They were just trying to trigger as many Dragon Rulers effect, stacking their graveyards, because obviously in Dragon Rulers, your graveyard is basically just another extension of your hand. So if you get like 7 cards in your grave and you still have like 6 cards in your hand, you're doing really well. So obviously the dice roll was quite important, but if you were going second, you weren't necessarily dying. You could still make Draco Sack, Big Eye, steal their Big Eye, steal their Big Eye, and then steal their Draco Sack, and obviously pretty much kill from there, which was indeed funny, but it actually did happen where Big Eye was stealing a Big Eye that was stealing another freaking card, and yeah, people were winning games like that, like I said. And then in 2014, my twin brother, yeah, he's not actually my twin brother, he's just another Algerian from Montreal, but whatever, you get the point, managed to win Worlds with Infernity, which I want to say was probably one of the first competitive decks to actually make a lot of negates turn 1 way more consistently than pretty much everyone else in the past, and that was because you could easily fetch multiple Infinity Barriers and Infinity Breaks with your engine, and obviously your opponent wouldn't even have a chance to play through so many Omni Negates and pops. I want to say that it was around the 2013 or 2014 mark where going first started mattering way more and negations and interruptions started mattering way more than ever before, but at the same time it is really easy to argue that with maybe wind up being able to hand loop you, yeah, the dice roll was kind of always important to a certain extent. And then later in 2017 we started seeing Zodiac's pretty much full power fusion substitute. The dice roll was literally a necessity if you didn't want your opponent to fusion substitute you and draw like 6 cards or something like that, setting Dimensional Barrier, which was a turn skipper. So even though the deck wasn't making generic Omni Negates, it was still trying to interrupt you, and that's the main thing that you have to take from this, is that people weren't just passing turn 1 with cards like Apocryphal Towers or Red Ice Flare Metal Dragon or Beals and just calling it a day. No, people were actually trying to apply pressure against you, against like their opponents, in order to prevent their opponents from doing anything to stop their follow-ups, you as the player, to actually kill your opponent. I know it might sound complicated, but you probably already played it in your head. And in late 2017 and pretty much the entire year of 2018, we started seeing the most modern version of Yu-Gi-Oh!, which was basically play as many hand traps as possible just to prevent your opponent from even having a chance to play. So spirals, you play literally every hand trap out there, Ghost Ogre, Ghost Bell, Ash, whatever, because you have to stop the double helix. And then with Electrum being insane in Pendulum, you really had to stop the Electrum as well, so Ghost Ogre, Veiler, whatever, maybe Ash on Pendulum Call if people were playing the card. And obviously in other decks after that, Danger Thunder, Orchist, whatever, some other form of hand traps like Lancia, which were kind of lingering cards, and Joel and Logbird started becoming good again, even though they were actually really bad back in the days, because every deck out there before was kind of mid-rangey, where even though they could combo, they were also setting actual trap cards or interruptions like Forbidden Chalice, Forbidden Lance, if that's even an interruption, not really, but you get the point. But yeah, this really gets us to where we are now, where we kind of have like no guarantee of even stopping the opponent. Like hand traps are just not enough. Board breaking cards also just, what are you gonna do? Dark Ruler no more, the Herald of Ultimateness? Sure, they still have 2 Herald of Orange Light, and if you can't really do anything too productive, well, you're going to die to the opponent's follow-up, because this is the most important thing about the Drytron deck, is that 2 cards gets you so much, like 4 cards in the hand and a bunch of cards in the grave, sorry, on the field, but also in the grave, so you can't just break a board and, like I said, call it a day. You have to make negations once you're done breaking your opponent's board, or you have to kill your opponent through every single negate out there, but obviously it's so complicated because that would imply that your opponent doesn't make a big enough board for you to break in the first place. So this is basically a paradox where we kind of don't want negations in the game, but if we don't want negations, then you're always going to die when you go first, because the opponent has a battle phase. With 6 cards in the hand, it's really hard to not kill the opponent when your opponent can't even interrupt or stop any of your plays. The game won't be fair or enjoyable if the player who goes second always wins. Become another form of dice roll Yu-Gi-Oh!, but like I said, the other way around. So as I said, interruptions and negates are needed in Yu-Gi-Oh! To a certain extent. You can even argue that every single deck out there should have some form of interruptions, but it would be nice to kind of put a limit on every competitive deck ceiling, just to ensure that you can't make too many negates and you can't kill your opponent way too easily. If you want to kill your opponent easily, there has to be some form of price that you have to pay. You can't just have everything for free, you know? But yeah, I'm pretty sure everyone can agree with me as I try to be as reasonable as possible. But if you have literally any opinion out there, please let us all know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching. It is Yasin signing out. Peace.